Hello and welcome to this video lesson on the National 5 Biology topic, food production. We're still on Unit 3, Life on Earth, and this is Key Area 5. Once again, here's the SQA course specification or mandatory knowledge section for this topic. Remember, this is all of the bits of knowledge and content that you could be tested on in a test or exam at this level for this topic. Now, this is actually a very long topic, especially compared to Key Area 4, so I've split it into 3 sections, and as usual, as we go through the theory for each section, there'll be some questions after each part so you can be sure that you're ready to move on. So our learning intention for this part is to learn about food production, and hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to state why increased food yields are important, explain why fertilizers can be used to increase food yields and the advantages and disadvantages of using them, explain why pesticides can also be used to increase food yield and again the advantages and disadvantages of using them, and finally describe alternatives to using fertilizers or pesticides. So our first part of this topic is looking at how we increase food production and why we might need to do so. So we need to increase food production or food yield because there's an ever-increasing human population, which we can see in this graph at the bottom of the screen. On the y-axis is the human population in billions, and on the x-axis we have the years. Now what you can see from this is from the 1800s up, there has been a large increase in the human population, from roughly 1 billion in 1800 to over 7 billion in 2020. So that's an increase of 6 billion people in just 220 years. Now this is important as all of those people need food to survive. When we talk about food yield, we mean the amount of crop which is harvested for food. So an increased human population requires an increased food yield. We focus on food yield and specifically crop yield throughout this topic on food production as we want to learn how farmers can increase their crop yield. Increasing crop yield or food yield can involve the use of 2 different things, fertilizers and pesticides. The rest of this topic will involve splitting these up and talking about them in more detail, but as a quick introduction, farmers use fertilizers and pesticides to try and increase food yield because we have a continuously increasing human population, as I mentioned previously. Fertilizers provide chemicals such as one called nitrates, which increase crop yield, and pesticides can be used to kill plants or animals, which reduce crop yield. In both of these cases, you'll notice I've underlined crop yield in the definition, and that's because this is what this topic is all about, ways to increase food production through increasing yield. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these questions either by saying the answer out loud or by writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we'll go through the answers. So question number 1 asks you what is food yield. So it's the amount of crop which is harvested for food. Number 2 asked why is it becoming more important for farmers to have an increased food yield, and that's because there's an increasing human population. Number 3 asks you one type of chemical added to the soil by farmers to increase crop yield contains nitrates, give the name of this chemical, and that is fertilizer. And finally, question 4 asks you what are pesticides used for, and that's to use them to kill plants or animals which reduce crop yield. So now we're going to move on and have a look at fertilizers in more detail. So remember first of all that fertilizers provide chemicals such as nitrates which increase crop yield. You only need to know about nitrates, which is a compound that contains nitrogen. You may have learned before about other components of fertilizers such as phosphorus or potassium before, but for National 5 you only have to know about nitrates. Now this diagram at the bottom shows you the different stages of how plants normally get their nitrates and what they use them for, and once we run through this I'll explain where fertilizers come in. So nitrates are commonly found in the soil, and these nitrates dissolved in the soil water can be absorbed from the soil into the plant. Inside the plant, the nitrates that are absorbed from the soil can be used to produce amino acids. Now a reminder that we spoke about amino acids in Area 3 of Unit 1, so DNA and the production of proteins, when we spoke about how amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So here plants can use the nitrates that they absorb from the soil to produce amino acids, and then they can synthesize those amino acids into plant proteins. So to produce amino acids, plants require nitrates from the soil. Now, sometimes you can be asked about how animals obtain or produce amino acids. If we think about this logically, animals can't absorb nitrates from the soil. They don't have roots to be able to do this. So, if animals can't absorb nitrates to produce amino acids themselves, they must get them from somewhere else. So, animals obtain amino acids from their diets. So, specifically, they consume plants or other animals to obtain amino acids for protein synthesis. So where do fertilizers come into this? Well, if you're a farmer and you're growing crops in your fields, then those plants are going to absorb the nitrates that are present in the soil. You want the plants to get lots of nitrates so that they can produce amino acids and synthesize these into plant proteins, therefore increasing crop yield. These nitrates in the soil can be used up quickly by plants, so they need to be replaced. Also, farmers want there to be high concentrations of nitrates in the soil to increase crop yield as much as possible. So fertilizers can be added to the soil to increase the nitrate content of the soil. So the more fertilizer that's added to the soil, the higher nitrate content, the more nitrates a plant can take in, which means it can make more amino acids and then synthesize more plant proteins, which will give a higher crop yield. Now, although that all seems great so far, there is a problem with overuse of fertilizers. So if there is an overuse of fertilizers by farmers, then they leach into fresh water, like this pond or lake in this example. So leaching is an important word, and it means that fertilizers have been carried through dissolving in water from where they should be, so the field, and has run off into a body of fresh water, like in this picture. Now remember, the fertilizer contains nitrates, so this adds extra unwanted nitrates to this area of fresh water. We don't want there to be extra nitrates in this water. In the fresh water, there'll probably already be some algae. Now, algae are photosynthetic organisms like plants, and just like plants, they would like the nitrates in fertilizer to promote the growth of plants on land. They also promote the growth of algae. So these extra nitrates will increase algal populations in the freshwater, which can cause something called an algal bloom. So algal blooms are where you get overgrowth of algae, and here you can see a thick layer of algae which is now on top of the freshwater pond or lake. Now, this is an issue because the algal blooms can reduce light levels. If there is a thick layer of algae over the top, sunlight will not be able to get through. Now, why is this an issue? Well, at the bottom here, you can see an aquatic plant, so a plant that lives underwater. And if this doesn't get light, it can't photosynthesize and it'll die. So the algal blooms reduce the light levels, which will kill aquatic plants in the environment. When organisms die, they decompose and become food for decomposers such as bacteria. So these dead plants, as well as some dead algae, become food for bacteria, which will therefore keep increasing in number. So these bacteria that feed on the dead plants and algae will also use up lots of oxygen that is dissolved in the water, and this will reduce the oxygen available for other organisms in the freshwater environment, like the fish. If there's not enough oxygen available in the water, these fish and other organisms will die, and this whole cycle will reduce the biodiversity in this ecosystem. So remember, biodiversity is the variety of living things in an ecosystem. So here the excess nitrates have created an overgrowth of algae and also bacteria, but the plants and other living things won't be able to survive. Now, it's really important that you can put all of those stages I just talked about in the previous slide into words, because this is a really common extended response question. So if you're asked about problems with the overuse of fertilizers, you could say that fertilizers can leach into fresh water, adding extra unwanted nitrates. This will increase algal populations, which can cause algal blooms. Algal blooms reduce the light levels, killing aquatic plants. These dead plants, as well as dead algae, become food for bacteria, which increase greatly in number. The bacteria use up large quantities of oxygen, reducing the oxygen availability for other organisms, and this reduces the overall biodiversity. So what's the solution to this? Well, farmers need to increase crop yield, and using fertilizers, which contain nitrates, is one way of doing this. However, we've just discussed the problems associated with the overuse of fertilizers, so what is an alternative? Well, scientists have used genetic engineering to alter the DNA of crop plants to allow them to grow well with less fertilizers. So, for example, a group of scientists have produced a genetically modified rice plant, which it can take up and use nitrogen for the soil more efficiently than varieties which are currently being grown. Now, this advancement allows farmers to reduce the quantities of fertiliser that they apply while maintaining that crop yield, which is so important. Now, also, I should remind you that this picture on the bottom right is genetic engineering example using a human gene in a bacterial cell, whereas in this topic here, we're talking about genetically modifying crops. So the host cell would be a plant cell instead, and human cells or DNA wouldn't be involved. So that was just a reminder that an alternative to using fertilizers, or a way to reduce fertilizer use, is to use genetically modified or GM crops. So let's try another set of quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these 7 questions, either by saying the answer out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and I'll give you question number 8 and then we'll go through the answers. So question number 8 is asking you to put these stages into order. So again, pause the video here and do the question, and then play the video to get all of your answers for all 8 questions. Okay, so question number 1 asked you, why do plants require nitrates? And that's to produce amino acids which can be synthesized into plant proteins. Number 2 asks you, how do animals obtain amino acids for protein synthesis? And that's by consuming other plants or animals. What name is given to the way in which fertilizers get from the soil into freshwater ecosystems? So the answer to number 3 is leaching. Number 4 asks, what effect do the excess nitrates from these fertilizers have on algal populations in the water? Now, if you ever see the term what effect, they're looking for increase, decrease, or stay the same. So if we're talking about the excess nitrates and then the algal populations in the water, the effect that that has, it will increase the algal populations. Question number 5 asks, what term describes the overgrowth of algae? And that's an algal bloom. Number 6 asks, what effect does overuse of nitrates have on biodiversity? So for this one, again, it's what effect. So they're looking at increase, decrease, or stay the same. So the answer here would be a decrease. So decreases biodiversity. Number 7 asks you to give one alternative to the use of fertilizers, and that is genetically modified or GM crops. Number 8 asks you to put the stages into the correct order. So the first stage should have been E, so fertilizers can leach into fresh water, adding extra unwanted nitrates. Then C, so this increases the algal population, causing an algal bloom. Then A, so that reduces the light levels, killing the aquatic plants. Then B, so bacteria feed on the dead plants and dead algae, and they greatly increase in number. And finally, D, the bacteria use up large quantities of oxygen, which reduces the oxygen available for other organisms. So let's move on now to look in more detail at pesticides, now that we've finished looking at fertilizers. So pests are organisms which damage crops. So things like caterpillars, aphids, any kind of insect like that would actually eat the crop plant. But remember, it doesn't need to necessarily be insects. Rabbits and other animals, or even plants, can also damage crops. So if crops are damaged, this will decrease their yield, so how much food can be harvested from them. So it's really important for farmers to prevent this. So plants and animals which reduce crop yield, referred to as pests, can be killed by using pesticides. So now we know what pesticides are and why they're used by farmers, we need to discuss a problem with them. So this is a different problem than the one we discussed for fertilizers. Pesticides can have a negative impact on the environment. Pesticides sprayed onto crops can accumulate or build up in the bodies of organisms over time. So here you can see in this diagram, we have the time increasing, and you can see the contaminant levels in the bodies of the organisms are also increasing. This is because pesticides are non-biodegradable. They don't break down naturally in the environment, so if they're taken into an organism's body, they are passed on to the next level in the food chain. As they are passed along the food chains, the toxicity, so how toxic the pesticide is, increases. This means the concentration of the pesticide builds up in the tissues of the organism and can cause them harm. Eventually, this can reach lethal levels at the top of the food chain. So in this example food chain here, you can see the levels of pesticide are quite low at the bottom of the food chain, but as we move up, the pesticides accumulate in the bodies of the organisms over time, and the toxicity will also increase. And in the case of the polar bear at the top of the food chain, this could be lethal or deadly. So here's a wee example to show you what we mean by this pesticide problem. So our producer in this food chain is a tomato plant, and the tomato plant has been sprayed by a pesticide to protect it from pests that may damage it and decrease the crop yield for the farmer. The concentration of the pesticide in the leaves is 0.5 molecules. Now let's imagine that an aphid comes along and eats 2 tomato leaves. It'll also absorb the pesticide, so 0.5 molecules of pesticide for each leaf it eats, so the single aphid will now have 1 molecule of pesticide. Now let's imagine that a lacewing eats 100 aphids, which are fed on this tomato plant. So the single lacewing will now have 100 molecules of pesticide inside it. Then the songbird, which is the next stage up in the food chain, eats 10 lacewings, so the songbird will now have 1,000 molecules of pesticide. And finally, at the top of the food chain, we have the peregrine falcon, which eats 5 songbirds, so we'll have 5,000 molecules of pesticide. So if we turn this into the food chain into a pyramid of energy, so it's easier to visualize, the tomato plant or the producer was sprayed with pesticides that had 0.5 molecules of pesticide in each of its leaves. The aphids, which are the primary consumer, would then have 1 molecule of pesticide inside it. The lacewings, which are the next stage up, so our secondary consumer, would have 100. The tertiary consumer, which is the songbird, would have 1,000. And at the top of the food chain, the falcon would end up with 5,000 molecules of pesticide. Now you can see that as we move up the food chain, the number of molecules of pesticide have gotten a lot higher, and therefore the toxicity, so how toxic this is to the organisms, would also have increased as well. And at this point, at the top of the food chain, this could be a lethal level for the falcon. So this buildup of toxic substances in living organisms is known as bioaccumulation. So you must know this word, and you also must know the definition. So bioaccumulation is the buildup of toxic substances in living organisms. And this makes sense if we break the word down. So bio means living and accumulation means build up. So the buildup of toxic substances in living organisms. So what's the solution to this? So what can farmers do as an alternative to spraying pesticides on their crops to protect them from pests? Well, in the case of fertilizers, we talked about how there was one solution or alternative, and that was to use GM crops. With pesticides, there's actually 2 alternatives. We can use genetically modified crops as well. So in this picture here, you can see GM crops in action. So this is a picture of Australian cotton, which on the left has been genetically modified, and on the right is the non-genetically modified version. GM Australian cotton crops have a built-in pesticide which makes them resilient to insects. So you can see on the left that these crops have not been damaged by insects or pests because they have that gene which allows them to be resilient to insects and produce the pesticide, whereas the pests on the right don't have that built-in pesticide, so they can be damaged by the insects. Another alternative to the use of pesticides on crops is biological control. So biological control starts with bio, so living things, and this is basically by using living things to control pest numbers, to reduce the number of pests. So specifically in biological control, natural predators, parasites or diseases are introduced to reduce the number of pests. Chemicals are not used. So here at the bottom are some pictures to give you some examples of biological control. So on the left-hand side, we have a picture of a ladybird. Ladybirds are natural predators of green flies, which are a type of pest. So green flies damage the crop plant and therefore reduce the crop yield. So what you can do as a farmer is you can use biological control by releasing the ladybirds, and they will eat or prey on those green fly, which will reduce the number of green flies and therefore reduce the damage to the plants as well. The example in the middle picture is another example of biological control, but this time it's using a parasite to reduce the number of pests. So this method is using a parasitic wasp. So here what happens is the parasitic wasp is released and it finds the aphids, the pests which are damaging the plant and reducing the crop yield. And the parasitic wasp inserts its egg inside the aphid's body. The aphid is still alive, and the egg of the parasitic wasp begins to hatch inside the aphid's body, and eventually the aphid dies and the full-grown baby parasitic wasp hatches out of the aphid's body. Then the cycle will begin again, and this produces more parasitic wasps, will then go on and find more aphids until the aphids are eliminated. The last example on the right-hand side is an example of using disease as a biological control method. So in this case, caterpillars are the pest, so damaging the crop plant. And in this case, a virus is released that kills the caterpillars. So that's an example of disease. So these are three examples of how you would use biological control, so natural predators, parasites, or disease, to reduce the number of pests without using chemicals, and this would be instead of using pesticides. So let's try some final quick questions on what we've covered so far to check your knowledge before we finish. So pause the video here and try these questions either by saying the answer out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we'll go through the answers. So the first question said that DDT is a pesticide and is toxic to wildlife. It can build up in their tissues, causing damage. What term describes the build-up of toxic substances in living organisms? And that is bioaccumulation. Number 2 says, as pesticides accumulate in the bodies of organisms over time and are passed along food chains, what happens to the toxicity? It increases. And number 3 asks you to give 2 alternatives to the use of pesticides. They are biological control and GM crops. So GM crops is an alternative to both fertilizers and pesticides, whereas biological control is only as an alternative to pesticides. So that's us finished learning about food production. So I hope you're now confident about stating why increased food yield is important, so because there's an increase in human population. You can explain why fertilizers can be used to increase food yield and the advantages and disadvantages of using them. I hope you can also explain why pesticides can be used to increase food yield and again the advantages and disadvantages of using it. And I hope you can now describe the alternatives to using fertilizers or pesticides. So in the case of fertilizers, GM crops, or in the case of pesticides, GM crops or biological control. Now, this was a really difficult topic with a lot of new information, so please feel free to go back and watch parts of the video again in the future if you do need a refresher. Thanks again for listening.